GDP figures not too bad? Think again. We're in for a rocky 2017. Analysis. Treasurer Scott Morrison says a decline in business investment is the core reason why Australia's GDP has contracted. If you believe the federal government and some commentators, there's nothing much to worry about, even though the economy has suddenly stalled and is going backwards by 0.5% per year. They say there is plenty to be pleased with in the latest figures. If you look at the national income figures, it's rosy days. And that's true. The national income surged last quarter. But the surge had nothing to do with good economic management. It was simply because our dollar dropped during that period. National income measures the money earned by Australians, whether that comes from overseas or at home. This surged mainly because the price of iron ore and coal has started to pick up, which, if you're a mining company, is great news. However, most of us aren't mining companies. Indeed, 60% of Australia's economy is made up of household consumption. For households, a declining Australian dollar means that for every imported good we buy, like cars, TVs, clothing, and, most importantly, Reese's peanut butter cup chocolates, we are, on average, paying more. This is particularly troublesome in the lead-up to the festival of buying cheap imported junk, also known as Christmas. So the national income figures are, at best, a bit of a distraction. It's a bit of goalpost moving by Treasurer Scott Morrison. For the past 25 years, every Australian government on both sides of politics has proudly declared that the true measure of the economy's health was GDP growth. Now that's gone negative, Mr. Morrison suddenly declares we needn't worry too much about that and instead focus on national income growth. Come on, Mr. Morrison, we weren't born yesterday. Actually, 821 Australians were born yesterday, but that's beside the point. For Australia to go into recession requires 6 months, where the figures stay negative. That means the next lot of figures the government releases in 3 months also have to be terrible for Australia to be in recession. For me, whether or not we're heading for recession is beside the point, because it's not just the headline figure of the GDP that's worrying. It's what has made the GDP decline that indicates this is the government is leading us into a disastrous 2017. The figures show that Australia is experiencing weakness in home building. It shaved 0.3% off the growth figure, and the amount of investment made in building and renovating private homes went down 1.6%. In the long term, this is a completely necessary thing to happen. Besides the West Coast, the rest of Australia has experienced a housing boom in the past few years, and with it, there has been a renovation boom, because people have been doing up their houses to keep pace with the perceived value of their homes. This growth has arguably kept Australia out of recession. Note that it's been private consumption that has done the heavy lifting. The government, meanwhile, has shown a distinct lack of interest in doing its share of the work in keeping the economy going. In 2013, they tried to cut government spending across the board. Since then, they've been essentially treading water on national economic reform. Problem is that this growth engine, funded by private spending, is spluttering out without any indication from the government that they've got a plan to replace it. Listen to a long line of commentators and you'll hear that an infrastructure boom is just around the corner. According to this line of thinking, these weak figures are good news because it'll spur the government into action and finally compel them to get serious about upgrading Australia's infrastructure. With great fanfare, the government recently announced it'll invest $50 billion in infrastructure. Which sounds great, except that they intend to spend that amount over 5 years. And it'll take a bit of time for the projects to get started. In fact, the only major projects that I'm aware that they've announced so far are of $893.7 million for inland rail and $700 million on a couple of road projects that get the figure up to $1.5 billion. Even if the government manages to spend the first $10 billion of the commitment in 2017, it will be a drop in the ocean. The Australian economy is a $1.5 trillion beast. Spending an extra $10 billion adds 0.007% to the economy. It's a rounding error. If the government was serious about using infrastructure as a means to keep Australia's economy out of recession, they'd need to start adding a zero to the end of their spending plans, and there is no sign that this government has any appetite to that sort of pump and prime approach.